I had been encouraged, sort of against my will, really, by Hansadutta to travel. He found out I had engineering ability, and he wanted me to fix the buses, and he was going on his world-travelling Sankirtan party. So we drove overland with Sachinandan and a whole group of devotees, mostly Germans. And my idea was that we'd meet in Vrindavan, where he was taking sannyas, and that I would get Harinam initiation there. That was my master plan. We were late. Obviously, it's a challenge to drive from Europe to India. And when we got there, Srila Prabhupada had left Vrindavan. And I met Lokanath Swami for the first time there. He'd taken sannyas at the same time. And that we started planning to go to Mayapur. And again, my plan was, okay, missed Vrindavan, but I'll get the chance. I'd never seen Srila Prabhupada. I'd had association with Mukunda Maharaj, or Mukunda Brahmachari then, and he'd inspired me so enthusiastically. I just couldn't wait to see Srila Prabhupada. So we drove again, the Grand Trunk Road from Vrindavan to Mayapur, and then as we got very close to Mayapur, we were in two big buses. One of them broke down, and I was the guy that fixed the bus, so I got out to fix the bus. All of the other devotees jumped in the other bus and drove off. Anyway, I fixed the bus, and then I was in a situation where I realized that I don't know how to get to Mayapur. You know, the devotees that we picked up in Calcutta, who knew the way, I wasn't one of them. Anyway, so I just yelled out the window, please, you know, which way to Mayapur? And somehow, by Lord Chaitanya's mercy, I arrived in Mayapur, jumped out. I was totally dirty, greasy, fixing the bus. I took a shower, put tilak on, and I ran, and as I entered the temple room, Prabhupada had just finished the initiation ceremony and stood up. But that first encounter of encountering the pure devotee, Mahabhagavat, was so profound that I knew at that time, I'd heard stories, I was enthusiastic, but somehow or other, I hadn't had that direct contact. So with that direct contact, I knew, okay, this is the person, this is going to guide me. So then we went on Sankirtan. We went out doing chanting, distributing books and so forth. And after about 6 months, we came back to Vrindavan. And I was still Bhakta Steve, Bhakta Bozo, and driving the bus. Lots of the devotees had fallen sick, they'd gotten all sorts of diseases. And so they concluded that, I eventually ended up driving the bus. And when we got to Vrindavan, Hansadutta approached me and said, why aren't you surrendering to Prabhupada? And I was like, what do you mean? He said, you've been in the movement like more than a year now, and you still haven't taken initiation. What's the problem? And I was like, well, we haven't really been in a situation, I tried, I've been trying, but we haven't succeeded. And he was like looking at me askance, thinking, there's something withholding. Anyway, later on that day, I got someone, devotee came to call me and said, Srila Prabhupada wants to see you. And I was initially thinking, as, I don't know, some devotees did, have I made some, mistake or faux pas, or is Prabhupada going to chastise me, or what's going to happen? So I walked round to Srila Prabhupada's room, slightly in trepidation, and walked into his room, his quarters in Vrindavan. Prabhupada was sitting behind his desk. And as I walked in, Prabhupada looked up and he said, your name is Ravi Das. And I was stunned. I simply stood there, mouth agape, like. And Hansadutta was standing next to Srila Prabhupada. I think it was just Srila Prabhupada and Hansadutta. I can't remember anybody else being in the room. And Hansadutta said, I think you should pay obeisances, Prabhu. And I suddenly came to my senses and paid obeisances. And as I sat up, Prabhupada was looking at me. And I wasn't quite sure what had happened exactly. You know, I'd been wanting this for such a long time, and now suddenly it had happened, well, but in a way that I wasn't sort of expecting. So Prabhupada could see this sort of puzzled look on my face. And I said to Srila Prabhupada, is that it? And Prabhupada looked at me like, and he said to me, what more do you want? And I was like, thrown back. What did I want? You know, Srila Prabhupada accepted me as his disciple, and suddenly I'm asking him, is that enough? And so he said, so I had to sort of think about, and I said, but Prabhupada, I've seen other devotees, they have some, you know, some yajna. Prabhupada said, that is mere formality. He said, initiation takes place here, in the heart. And I guess, yeah, I realized that in Mayapur, that experience had been there when I'd accepted Prabhupada, and that was my experience. And then later the same day, I got second, and so another devotee came and said, Prabhupada wants to see you. And I was like, oh, you know, he's decided against it. He's realized I'm a rascal. You know, he's going to say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. So I went to see him, and then the devotees were waiting to get second initiation. And some of them were like, you know, BBT devotees, and they were like brahmanas, you know, they were like chanting and thinking of shlokas, and they were saying, how many shlokas do you know? And I was like, oh my goodness, you know, I hadn't expected this. Anyway, then I went in, and Prabhupada recited the Gayatri. Oh, no, yeah, right. So Prabhupada said, do you know how to count? And I said, well, yes. So Prabhupada said, like this, and he showed me how to count. But Prabhupada's thumb was very flexible. So when he got to the last number, his thumb didn't touch the last digit, you know. So then he said, so you do. So I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And Prabhupada said, no, not like that, like this. And they did it again. And I couldn't understand. I thought I was doing the same thing. So then I asked Prabhupada, is it off or on? He said, what do you mean, off or on? I said, is the thumb here? And he was like, yes. And I thought, okay. So I got that. So that was my Gayatri Diksha.
I joined ISKCON in Chicago when the temple was in Evanston. For the viewers who may not know where Evanston is, there's a lot of people, I was surprised, here in America. Evanston is where Northwestern University is located. It's the first suburb north of Chicago. So I was 17 years old, long story. I moved into the temple in February 1973. A devotee said, why don't you come and stay for 3 days? 3 days went to a week went to a month. And 45 years have gone by. But we didn't see Prabhupada during 1973. He came to New York, Dallas, and Los Angeles. Chicago was out of the way. I was a new devotee. The temple president came here. And that's when I got the signal to go to India. And about a year to the day later, I did. And on the way, I asked in New York temple, and I found out that Prabhupada was in Vrindavan. And the flight actually stopped in Delhi, among other places. And I got out. They allowed me to make a phone call, which my bags were checked to Bombay, but I couldn't get a number. I didn't know any number in Vrindavan. But when I landed in Bombay, I was able to actually phone the temple. They came, pick me up in a jeep. The late Sridhar Swami, who was a brahmachari at the time. Prabhupada came the next day. And we saw him at the airport. We went to receive him at the airport. And I remember hearing his voice, and it was just like on the cassettes, that because we were listening to Prabhupada's classes on the cassettes. It struck me at the time, you know, that Prabhupada was the same as his tapes. So, yeah, Vani and Vapu aren't, well, they're different and they're not different. The Vani is more important, as Prabhupada taught. Philosophically, we were mesmerized. I mean, it wasn't a blind following cult. Prabhupada was teaching the Bhagavatam. And that came through. You know, I always thought all these years that we weren't blind followers, but we were being taught traditional, you know, Vedic system, the Vedic knowledge, which is different from, you know, blindly following somebody who concocted his own philosophy. So that, right from the day one, living in the US and then coming to India.
Well, I came to LA the end of 71. Dinabandhu and Akuti dropped me there. I used to visit temples. And I was in Santa Barbara, and they said, Prabhupada's going to come. And so they said, we're going to take you to the big temple. And I didn't want to go to LA. I just liked the countryside. And they said, oh, no, we're going to meet, you know, Prabhupada's going to come. And it turned out that Prabhupada wasn't going to come for a couple of months, but they deposited me in LA. The first time Srila Prabhupada came to LA, and the first time I saw Srila Prabhupada, actually I saw his feet first, because he was coming, and I was helping in the temple room, and then there was, he's coming, and I hit the floor. And then, actually, I just saw these golden feet walking by me, and I went, it was like the feet of a master, and they were actually luminous. And I just remember meeting Prabhupada's feet, and then looking up and seeing this giant. And Prabhupada was only a small man, but it was like, I looked up, and there was Srila Prabhupada, and just walking like a nobleman, you know, how Srila Prabhupada walked, and just with purpose and with grace. So that was the first day I met Srila Prabhupada. I didn't meet you, I met Srila Prabhupada's presence in this incarnation. Yeah.
I first saw Prabhupada in New Vrindavan in 1972. I had visited one temple, and I was married with a child at the time, and they didn't have really any facility for householders, and they suggested, well, we have a farm where a lot of our families go. And so this was 72, and actually that was Seattle, Washington. We were from Illinois. So we drove all the way back. We had gone from Illinois to Seattle. We drove all the way back to West Virginia, about over 2,000 miles. And we finally found the place, going through the winding hills of West Virginia. We came to the temple, and all these devotees were there. And we had no idea what was going on. And then people started saying, he's coming, he's coming. And we walked into the temple room, and it turned out that it was the day after Vyasa Puja in 1972. Srila Prabhupada had just installed Radha Vrindavan Chandra in the farm, and he was about to sit down and give an evening class, a Bhagavad Gita class. Well, first there was Artik, which was just incredible. So it was my wife, Manjuali, and I, and we saw Srila Prabhupada speak there in New Vrindavan with the devotees. And we didn't know a lot of philosophy then. We'd read Bhagavad Gita some, and Prabhupada's accent, of course, was heavy and hard for us to understand. So even though I didn't hear many of his words exactly, my wife and I at that moment were absolutely convinced this was our guru. This was our spiritual master. We had found him. And Prabhupada's whole presence and his demeanor was just amazing. You could practically, at least to us, when he would close his eyes, of course, when he spoke, and sometimes he would open his eyes wide, and you could practically see light coming from his eyes. I mean, it was just such an amazing experience, just being in his presence. We were convinced. And anyway, we found out they were opening a temple in Chicago. Our home is Illinois, and so we drove back and joined the Chicago temple after that.
I went, as lots of devotees did, wherever Srila Prabhupada went, you wanted to go and be there. So Prabhupada went from Vrindavan to Delhi, and I followed him to Delhi and had the opportunity to go on a morning walk. And having a Western mind, I had read that there's a more powerful mantra than the Maha Mantra, the Panchatattva mantra, because you can't commit offenses. And I was meditating on this point, that actually maybe I should chant more of the Panchatattva Mahamantra. And then I began to think with my Western mind, well, if Lord Chaitanya's very merciful and therefore doesn't accept, who's more merciful than Lord Chaitanya and Lord Nityananda? And I thought it's Srila Prabhupada. So the idea in my mind started to sort of come that actually what I really should be chanting on my japa beads was not the Maha Mantra or the Panchatattva mantra, but Srila Prabhupada. This was my great idea. So on the morning walk, I tested the theory initially by asking Prabhupada about spiritual master, you know, on the second offense. Because I was thinking, is it offensive? You know, because it says you shouldn't think of the names of demigods, but what about the name of the spiritual master? Does that fall in the same category? So Lokanath Swami was there, and Prabhupada sort of encouraged Lokanath to answer. But I was slightly dissatisfied that I didn't get the direct answer. So another opportunity came up, and I asked Srila Prabhupada, is the Panchatattva Mahamantra, I've read that it's more powerful? So he said, yes. So I said, but more merciful than Lord Chaitanya is you. So can I chant your name in japa? And he said, have I asked you to do that? And I said, no, Srila Prabhupada. He said, it's right, the Panchatattva is more powerful, but Lord Chaitanya has asked us to chant the Maha Mantra, and therefore we chant the Maha Mantra. So it said that one should appear a fool before the spiritual master. With some of us it's slightly easier than others, so that was my master plan quashed to make a rapid advancement by chanting Prabhupada's name. And during that time there was some Pungal program, and devotees were, and the devotees started to chant Haribol a lot. They chanted the Maha Mantra, but then when they got in, it was sort of popular then that we chant different ways of Haribol. And during the kirtan, which was led by a sannyasi, Prabhupada stopped. He said, stop the kirtan. And we all, what happened? And then Prabhupada got Pradyumna's son to lead the kirtan. And he said, just chant the Maha Mantra. And at that point I realized, you know, don't deviate. Prabhupada wanted us to follow. And that was a very important lesson. It's you know, our Western minds are very prone to deviation. And so I was out in Sankirtan book distribution, and I was driving the van, and I came back to Delhi a little bit earlier because I had a van. I didn't have to take the bus or anything. And Prabhupada was giving darshan, so I went up, and there was just an Indian family in the darshan room, and Prabhupada was talking in Hindi. And I sat to one side, just, you know, as we did, just to be with Srila Prabhupada. And in the midst of the conversation, which Prabhupada was addressing to this Indian family, he said in English, turn the fan on. So there was a, you know, mid-sentence, that English part came in. And I understood that part. I speak English. And I was thinking, well, was Prabhupada addressing that, you know, gentleman? He was there with his wife and family. And I began to feel very uncomfortable that no one was turning the fan. Well, I was the only one there. I began to feel more and more uncomfortable that this wasn't happening. I'd heard it, but I hadn't acted upon it. Anyway, then mid-sentence, Prabhupada turned and looked at me and said, why don't you turn the fan on? And it shocked me, like, you know, I leapt up and I ran to the back of the room. And in India, there's like 1 million switches on the panel, and I just hit everything. I turned the lights on, the fans on, everything, and then spent ages trying to figure out which was the fan that Prabhupada went on. But the realization was that Prabhupada gives the same instructions to everyone, but sometimes, you know, Bhaktisiddhanta did the same thing. He told everyone to preach, but Prabhupada heard the preaching. And I heard and I didn't act upon it. And I really reflected on it later that actually when you hear an instruction from Prabhupada, he's not just shooting the breeze, he's giving you an instruction. So that was a vital lesson.
So when I came to Bombay, by coincidence, the Chicago GBC was Satsvarup Maharaj. He happened to have taken over as Prabhupada's personal secretary and servant. There was no servant at that time I imagine there was a gap between Shrutakirti and Hari Shori or whoever. So he had to cook for Prabhupada, he had to massage Prabhupada and take care of the correspondence. And so he asked me if I would come and clean the pots after he cooked for Prabhupada. So it was a very simple service, and they're very tiny pots. So one day I was in the kitchen, and suddenly I was cleaning the pots, and the door flew open, and there was Prabhupada with just a kurta, no dhoti. It was a long kurta. And he said, he chastised me. He said, "Can't you hear someone's at the door?" And of course I bowed down and I said, "No, Srila Prabhupada." "Well, go and get the door." And sure enough, somebody had been ringing the bell at the door. But in the kitchen and washing the pots, I couldn't hear it. And due to that service, I was able to stay for the darshan period. Can I go into that? So people used to come and meet Prabhupada from 4 to 5 every day. Respectable people. And I remember him showing Bhakti Swarup Damodar Maharaj's, well, the late Bhakti Swarup Damodar's Scientific Basis of Krishna Consciousness book. And he was very proud of that book. And he was effusive is the right word. Very enthusiastic and he kept praising the book and how Krishna consciousness is not mental speculation, but it's scientific. And that struck me. I guess it was the preaching spirit. Prabhupada was always preaching. And another thing that struck me when Prabhupada was effusively praising to the high heavens this book of Bhakti Swarup Damodar, his disciple, was how much Prabhupada wanted his disciples to write. Of course, we're all distributing Prabhupada's books, but it's not that nobody else should write books. And the book should be based on, the Vedic outlook, the Vedic conclusion. I think the scientific basis of Krishna consciousness was just one of the beginning of different disciples who wrote. Of course, Bhakti Swarup Damodar Maharaj was highly inspired by Prabhupada to preach.
One other very interesting incident there was we had our Bhaktivedanta Institute scholars come, and there was one night darshan where they were giving a presentation to Prabhupada, and I was fortunate enough to be able to be in that darshan. And they were presenting many of their preliminary ideas. Bhakti Swarup Damodar Maharaj, then Brahmachari, was presenting some of the concepts that they were putting into their books, what would later become Life Comes from Life and their other writings. And it was almost like they wanted to give them first to Srila Prabhupada, kind of get his seal of approval, so then they would continue publishing their books. At one point, Swarup Damodar was talking about the difference between life and matter. So he gave a very obvious example. Things that are living, and he said, and things that are not living or dead, such as rocks or stones. Prabhupada stopped him, said, "Oh, stones can be alive?" Well, everyone had to kind of stop and take that in. We hadn't heard anything like this before, and I could see that the scientists were busy trying to have to redo that part of the paper, the presentation, like, what does Prabhupada mean? And Prabhupada later went on to explain how all living entities go through the different stages of life, from birth, transformation, byproducts, dwindling, and death. And he said, so? He says, you see a mountain. It goes through all these processes. It grows, it stops, etc. And someone said, what about like a crystal? And Prabhupada said, yes, a crystal. You see it's growing. And he gave examples like this. There's still a little confusion about that because someone said, well, when you see a rock, you pick up a rock, it doesn't seem to be alive. Prabhupada said, no, it's dead now. Oh. He said, just like you go in a forest. A tree is alive. It falls. It dies. And you see the log and it's decomposing. It was alive. Now it's dead. In the same way, many of these stones or mountains or rocks were alive and now they're not. So it actually made perfect sense, but it was very different from our conception. And so Prabhupada in this way was always giving us this very new and fresh information and knowledge.
I was called to his association a few times. The first time, obviously, when I got initiated, I got initiated in 1972 on Srila Dev's appearance day. And then he gave me the name Manjuali Devi Dasi. And then he looked at me and he said, Gopi name. And then I just accepted him as my guru. And 3 months later, on Balaram's appearance day, they needed help in the kitchen. And I got a Brahmin initiation. And then I went up to Srila Prabhupada, and that was my first actually contact of speaking with Srila Prabhupada, going into his room to receive Gayatri Mantra and sitting right next to him. And the quality that Srila Prabhupada had at that moment in time, I believe, was patience, because I was so nervous. I was trying to do the Gayatri, and he looked at me and he said, not on the cracks. And I was just like shaking, and he went, no, and he went through with me a few times, the Gayatri Mantra and how you touch the thumb to the fingers. And then finally I got it. But it took me a few times to kind of just become present. And so the quality of Srila Prabhupada was patience in that moment. The next time, actually, I had association with Srila Prabhupada, and I have spoken about this before, and I hope I get all the facts right, but was when I got married. And this was in 1972, and I was a brahmachari. I had been in the ashram for 10 months, though I had been in other ashrams, other temples, but that was, I was asked to get married, and I had 24 hours to make up my mind. and then 7 days later, I was getting married to Jayatirtha, who was the temple president at that time. Srila Prabhupada invited us to come to his rooms after the wedding ceremony. And the wedding ceremony was in the garden of Dayananda and Nandarani. And Dayananda was the priest. And this was one of the first times when Prabhupada was getting upset because devotees weren't following their vows. And they were getting married in front of the deity, and then they weren't following through. Somebody would leave or something would break. So Prabhupada said, no, you get married in the garden, and then you come come to see me. So we made, so within 7 days it was make a feast, make a kurta, make a bead bag, and garlands, do everything. And so we went to Srila Prabhupada's quarters, and at that time Prabhupada was giving, it was the 1st of October, 1972. So on the 26th of October, Prabhupada in Los Angeles gave a lecture. And he was talking about his own marriage. And he was talking about that, his father, he was some attraction to one particular woman, but his father chose the one that was a little less attractive because a beautiful wife was the enemy, right? And so anyway, so this was in the background. That was like 4 days before or something. And so anyway, we come to meet Srila Prabhupada in the garden in Los Angeles. And Prabhupada was sitting on his asana. And it was early afternoon. And so we come with a plate of prasad. And we're at the gateway of the doorway. And Srila Prabhupada looks up at me. And he looks at Jayatirtha, and then he looks at me. He said, oh, she is beautiful. I went, oh my God, I'm an enemy already. And then he smiled, this like oceanic smile, and just kind of winked, And it was like he was just being a loving father, and he was telling, and so he had us come and sit. And so we were just kind of, and I gave him the plate of prasad, and then we sat down, and we were just so far back, and he said, no, come closer, come closer. And so it was like we were like bumping up against Srila Prabhupada, really right there. And he he just was so full of affection, you know, and then and so fatherly. And so we sat there, and so he took his drink, and, you know, the Prashadam was there. He just took the drink because he had taken, and he lifted his hand, you know, like he would with the drink. And then he savored it, and then he closed it, and he lifted it again. He looked over at Chaitya and said, "And she can cook." I went, "Phew, at least I can do something." No, by your grace, Srila Prabhupada. And then he asked so lovingly, "So what do your parents think of this Krishna consciousness, you know?" And it was just like a funny story, because I rang my mother a couple of days before the wedding and said, "Oh, by the way, Mom, I'm getting married on Saturday." And she said, "Can I come?" In Chicago she was. So we got her a ticket and she came, but she didn't come into the garden with Prabhupada, but she was the only lady in the wedding who sat on a chair, you know, everyone, because it was all devotees, you know. So Chaitya's parents had come. Anyway, I told Srila Prabhupada that my mother was very favorable and respectful, and that when she washed her dishes, she used to chant Hare Krishna. You know, she was a Catholic, but she did that. And then I presented Prabhupada. My mother had given me a check for my wedding for $50. And so I presented Prabhupada with my dowry, my check, you know, which came back to me years later. My mother saved it with his signature on the back of it from the 1st of October, 72. AC, paid to the account of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. And it was really, really. So the qualities of Srila Prabhupada from that moment in time: loving father, humor, personal, and a sense of humor, you know, really. And then he spoke to me because he knew that I only asked Chaitya, you know, I never spoke to him except for, you know, what color are the deities wearing tomorrow? I mean, we never had a conversation. And Prabhupada looked at me thinking, oh my God, you know, this is India, you know, because they get married without seeing. And he looked at me and he said, affection comes through service. If Krishna is in the center, your marriage will be successful.
That was in the garden.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Yeah. When we were sitting at his feet, he looked at me and he just said, yes. He could tell, you know, that this was a big surrender, wasn't it? Like sitting on this chair today, you know, a big surrender. No, but it was so loving, and I can still see his smile and his, and still feel his affection and receive his blessing, really, because he, you know, he blessed us. And he could see what the journey ahead would be. I had no clue, but I knew it would be good for my spiritual life. And that was Srila Prabhupada's gift.
Srila Prabhupada always challenged us to do more, to get better results, to get greater results. One example of this was in Miami in 1974 when he came to visit. We had actually not been distributing books, but about a month or two before, I think, knowing Srila Prabhupada was coming, we ordered 10,000 Back to Godheads, and we were distributing Back to Godheads. So when Prabhupada came, one of the first questions he asked the temple president was, "Are you distributing my books?" And he said proudly, "Yes, we are distributing 10,000 Back to Godheads this month." And Srila Prabhupada said, "Oh, no big books?" So kind of took us all a little bit by surprise. So Srila Prabhupada was never satisfied with small results. He wanted to keep pushing us to do more. And that was one of the things that we see consistently throughout Srila Prabhupada. But he did it in such a way that was always encouraging to us.
Yeah, so we traveled around with our bus party doing programs, and obviously occasionally we'd return to the temple and spend some time there repairing the bus. And so we came back to Vrindavan after some time. At that time, the buses could only stay in India for a certain period of time. They couldn't stay there forever. They had to leave. And of course, so many of the devotees had dropped out. that there were very few of the 20 or 30 devotees on the bus. I think there's probably just a real handful left. But more Indian boys had come on board. Atmatattva had joined in Chandigarh. So there were a few sort of Indian boys who'd come on. But I was having slight misgivings about the bus myself, because whenever we'd go, people were very interested in the bus. Not, you know, they would ask about the bus and where's the bus come from. I thought, we're not here to tell them about buses. We had them tell them about Krishna. So when we got to Vrindavan, and you know, there were some issues. The personalities, I'm sure you're aware, that were challenging personalities that were on the bus. And so the bus had to leave, and I had remained healthy, and I liked India. It was unexpected. I hadn't planned to come to India, but when I got there, I really liked it. So the buses had to go, but what were the devotees going to do that were on the buses? So again, we approached Srila Prabhupada in Vrindavan, and that's when Prabhupada came up with the idea of Padayatra. And I'm born in London. I'm not, you know, sort of a rural person. And the way that Prabhupada was describing Padayatra, I was a little fearful of. As he described it, you know, with enthusiasm, that Vaishnavas don't travel with grains, and you simply, you know, the tradition was that brahmacharis and sannyasis would walk everywhere, just go from village to village. I wasn't sure that I was cut out for that particular experience. So, and some of the Indian boys I noticed, because often we pick up young Indian boys like Atmatattva who'd stayed with sadhus and, you know, had a real interest in Vedic culture. They would jump in. I mean, when Atmatattva joined, he'd read the Bhagavatam and so forth, and, you know, he knew everything, you know, where we were sort of, I don't know, the fourth or fifth canto or something. So, you know, it was a little bit difficult, but I noticed that some of these boys would chant shlokas, and Prabhupada would really like it. They would chant some shloka glorifying Guru. I was like, okay, this is a really good. So I went and looked through the Bhagavatam. I was like, okay, how can I approach Prabhupada and see if I could maybe get out of this Padayatra service? So then I saw this Yad Yada Charity Shri. Whatever great people do, that's the people follow. I thought, okay, this is my ticket. So in Darshan, we were there, and I said to Prabhupada, you know, this Padayatra walking places, you know, Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Yada Yada Charity Shri, whatever great people do, lesser people follow. So why are we going to the villages? You know, well, we won't find the great people there. So Prabhupada immediately shot back. He said, who are these great people that you want to preach to? No, I hadn't thought it through. So, okay, who are these people? And because I was thinking, you know, I'd quite like to go along and preach to life members, or have sumptuous prasadam and be treated in a very sort of dignified manner, not wandering around the countryside, you know, just on foot. So I said, people in the media, people in films, sports people, people on TV. How about those people? But I said, these people are not great. He said, in Kali Yuga, anybody that chants Hare Krishna, they are great. And those people you'll find in the villages. So he said, but don't, he could see my concern. So Prabhupada said, but don't worry, Lokanath is village boy, and he will look after you. So he said, we'll meet in Kumbh Mela and review. So this lesson to me was actually Prabhupada's wonderful, caring nature. He could see I was concerned. I wanted to bail, you know. Maybe I should take the bus and leave, go back to Europe or something. But he was saying, anybody can drive the bus. Take the bus. Anybody can go. I took the bus and I dumped it somewhere in, I can't remember, it was in the Khyber Pass somewhere. We auctioned it off or something crazy thing. But so Prabhupada was saying, so, you know, this is what you should try. Just try and see. And I saw. So the way that Prabhupada presented it, I thought, okay, you know, it's only halfway between Vrindavan and Kumbh Mela. You know, we can make it there, and I can bear that. So then I sort of tacitly agreed that I could go. And then in the evening time, Prabhupada was lecturing in the courtyard of Vrindavan under the tamal tree, in the courtyard there. And he was lecturing in Hindi, so the local people were coming, and Prabhupada was speaking in Hindi. So that, you know, we were there. and the devotees would come, but after 2 or 3 days listening to Prabhupada lecture in Hindi, some of the non-Hindi speaking devotees started to think, yeah, you know, I could be washing my dhoti, I could, you know, be taking some extra rest, whatever. You know, you're thinking, I've got better things to do. So, so after 3 or 4 days, there was just, you know, 2 or 3 devotees, Western devotees coming. And Prabhupada looked around and he was, where are the devotees? And I thought, I'm not going to say anything. Some very brave devotee, I can't remember if it was Satswarup Maharaj. Anyway, some of the devotees that were there, they said, oh, Prabhupada, you're lecturing in Hindi, and you know, we can't understand. And Prabhupada said, you do not understand when I talk in English. So, and then he said, the devotee should come every evening. It's very important that you hear from the spiritual master. And that was, again, a great lesson. It doesn't matter if you understand or don't understand. Because I had another experience, this was much later on, we were going back to get books from Mumbai temple. And we went to see Srila Prabhupada, and he was inquiring, what books are you distributing? Prabhupada was always very interesting in what you're doing. He was like, well, you know, what are you doing? So we said, we're distributing which books? And I think it was Marathi Beyond Birth and Death, little books, and Bhagavad Darshan, like Hindi Back to God, or Marathi Back to Godhead. And so then we were in Prabhupada's room, and Prabhupada said to Lokanath, he said, will you read me some? So Lokanath said, okay, well, going down to the Sankirtan, asked me to go to the Sankirtan and bring back a book. And then Lokanath started reading, because he's from Maharashtra, he speaks Marathi. So he read a few pages, but obviously his interest was... So he asked Prabhupada, Prabhupada, do you speak Marathi? Do you understand Marathi? Prabhupada said, no, but it's always nice to hear about Krishna. So that was much later on, but again, a wonderful, you know, Prabhupada was eager to hear about Krishna. It didn't matter whether you understood or not. It was Krishna's pastimes.
Prabhupada came to Madras, which is now called Chennai, on January 1st, 1976. So there was a 2-day program there. On the morning of the second day, we went on a morning walk with Prabhupada. And after that, there's an interesting story there. I was sent a day early to Nellore to check on the arrangements. So the next day, 3rd January, Prabhupada and I guess there were 20 devotees came by train. It was a 3-hour train ride from Madras, Chennai, to Nellore. It's 160 kilometers north of Chennai. So at the station were hundreds of townspeople, the mayor, girls in traditional dresses there's a system of having a coconut in a basket on your head. And these are little tiny girls, like 10 years of age. And then there's a traditional horn instrument called the nadaswaram. In North India, the Shehnai is short. South India, nadaswaram, especially all over South. And there's these big drums that they play with it called the tawil. And then Brahmins chanting Vedic mantras from the Vedas. So you had these 3 groups, and the 4th group were the townspeople. And when the train arrived, you know, the girls come up and they hand a coconut, or they stand there as a form of welcome. I think the Brahmanas have a full pot, which is called a kumbha, and they give it to him and they chant the mantras as a show of respect and as a part of the welcome. And the nadaswarams are playing, and seeing all this, Prabhupada turned to the group of his disciples and said, Vedic culture is more intact in South India. The purport of that is that Prabhupada's movement is meant to spread Vedic culture. And what is culture? Dress, food, your daily activities, like early to bed and early to rise, which we have. Get up in the Brahma Muhurta. Immediately, you know, in the morning, take a bath, cleanse yourself, brush your teeth, which many people around the world don't do. So all of these things are part of Vedic culture. Shaving the head, keeping the sika, men wearing dhotis, women wearing saris, and sometime in the future, you know, we changed our place of residence, those of us who went to India from here. We changed our religion. We changed our dress. We changed our names when we got initiated. we have to change our language because, well, Lord Krishna didn't speak in English. We believe he knows all the languages, but the Gita and the Bhagavad are spoken in Sanskritam. So that is on the deck, on the cards. It's on the table sometime. So Prabhupada said Vedic culture. So culture means many things. And specifically, Prabhupada was there to propagate Vedic culture. It comes throughout his books, his conversations, his lectures, and his letters. And so his aim was very clear, and he was always focused on that. So that's an example of how Prabhupada was focused on teaching to his disciples Vedic culture, even though he used English mostly. But there were some Hindi and Bengali lectures in India.
Okay, the scene is 1976, Bhaktivedanta Manor, Srila Prabhupada's bedroom. George Harrison visiting. We were called up, Prabhupada called up because he wanted prasadam for George. And he asked me to make samosas for George. I used to do that when George used to come. And he also wanted us to serve George lunch in his bedroom because Prabhupada wasn't very well that day. And so he was meeting devotees from his bed, which was in his quarters at the Bhaktivedanta Manor upstairs. And I just remember the scene was set. Prabhupada was sitting on his bed with many pillows behind him. There was all white covers. And it was like Prabhupada was riding a swan. He was like his bed was, you know, his palanquin, or he was on the back of a swan, you know, with all the white. And George came in. And I witnessed Prabhupada telling George, and George sat on the floor. And Prabhupada said, no, no, sit on the chair, Prabhupada's chair. And George said, no, no, no. And Prabhupada said, sit on the chair with a more firm voice. And Prabhupada and George obeyed and sat on that little white chair that's in the corner in Srila Prabhupada's bedroom at this time. And then Prabhupada asked us to bring prasad to serve George, and I think Brahmananda was there, and Jaitirtha and some of the other senior devotees. Prabhupada instructed us from the bed to put the sheets out and to make that just in front of the windows, so then put all the plates out and serve lunch. And Prabhupada just again had a drink. He wasn't eating from in the bed, but he just had his drink, little fingers up in the air. And so we served, and Prabhupada was having a lively conversation with George and with all the devotees. And I wasn't a party to the conversation because we were in service at that time, but it was seeing Srila Prabhupada's magnanimity again, and his, you know, he wasn't feeling well, but he was still from his bed preaching. Just like at the end, from his last breath, he was preaching. So another lesson is that, you know, I don't feel I'm going to have the day off. No days off. And another thing is, which I witnessed, was Srila Prabhupada's affection for George, which was really tangible and present, you know, in the way he, you know, ordered him to sit in his chair, and, you know, you don't sit in the Guru's chair, you know. But George surrendered, you know, because Prabhupada was so loving and forceful, you know, and didn't want him, you know, he came and sat on the floor for prasad, but, you know, and so that was another thing. Another time when I didn't have the personal exchange with Srila Prabhupada other than make the samosas for George. And he wanted samosas, he wanted tomato chutney, and strawberry nectar. That was Prabhupada's order. fulfilled. Thank you, Srila Prabhupada. So that's that story.
In Potomac, which was in 1976 when Prabhupada came. It was actually the centennial, and there's some other stories about that. But just to show his attention to detail, the first thing is Prabhupada came to his quarters, and we had just constructed a brand new bathroom, or remodeled the bathroom completely. Apparently, in his last stop, the toilet wasn't working. So we said, "Are you sure everything works?" And we said, "Absolutely, Prabhupada. It's a brand new bathroom." He says, we'll see. He was a little bit incredulous. So the first thing he did was ask for some chapati dough. He took the dough, rolled it in a ball, put it in the toilet, and flushed it to make sure it was working. And so he was satisfied. So what happened is about 2 days later, the shower, fortunately, I think he wasn't in it and there was no harm, but the whole glass shower door fell out and broke on the ground. So Prabhupada's apprehension about our new bathroom was well-founded.
So we started the Padayatra, and again, being a Westerner, I was thinking A to B, Vrindavan to Mayapur, Grand Trunk Road. We'll just chug along there and we'll get to Kumbh Mela, Allahabad, and then we'll go on. And it was not like that. We'd arrive at a village, Prabhupada instructed us very clearly. You go to the village, you go to the well, start kirtan, where it's water is pure. You go round, you beg for grains, you beg for food grains, you prepare the food grains, you do evening pravachan, lecture, and kirtan, distribute the prasadam, you move on. Simple formula. So we'd arrive at the village, and they'd be so thrilled. Of course, this was still in Braj when we started off. They'd be so thrilled that we'd arrived. And we started off with quite a lot of devotees, 20 or 30 devotees. So, it was enthusiastic kirtans, and Prabhu was really behind the project. He loved it. Oh, another story I've just remembered. So, but then we get to one village, and then the village will say, "Oh, you've come to, this village, but my village, we just installed Tulsi plant, Radha and Krishna, something that they really wanted us to go to." And then we get to that village, and the other village, and we weren't going A to B at all. We were going X, Y, and Z, and not actually making any. We were just meandering around Braj, basically. And we had books to carry, and our suitcase, not very big, in a little box with a dhoti and a lota and a Bhagavad Gita. That was it. So Lokanath said, "We need a cart. We need a bullock cart to carry the deities and carry, the books and our equipment, so we can do Sankirtan and the bullocks can go and drop us off." Because we weren't, so then we could decide which direction we wanted to go. So Lokanath Swami said, "Go back to Vrindavan and I'll give you 2 letters to Srila Prabhupada, copy, of the letter, and you give the letter to Prabhupada's secretary, and if you don't, Prabhupada doesn't call you in a couple of days, then go to the darshan and hand it directly into Prabhupada's hand." And Lokanath said, "And come back with a bullock cart." He said, "Because Srila Prabhupada may offer to give you books, but, that will take us 10 years to raise enough money for a cart." So he said, "So don't come back with books, come back with a cart." So I journeyed back to Vrindavan and dutifully went to Prabhupada's room, gave the letter to his secretary, and waited, went to the lectures, which just, it was great. Prabhupada was lecturing in the morning, in the evening, so it was really fantastic, and but no call. So I thought, okay, well, I have to deliver it directly to Srila Prabhupada. So darshan one evening in Prabhupada's room, and I stood up and I said, "This is a letter from Lokanath Swami." The secretary was there, and he looked at me slightly crooked, like, "Hey, this is not right." But I gave it directly to Prabhupada. Prabhupada said, "Okay." Next morning, Prabhupada called me into his room, and he said, "I've received the letter from Lokanath Swami regarding the bullock cart." So in the Krishna book, there's some beautiful pictures of Krishna going from Gokul to Vrindavan, these beautiful carts in Vrindavan. You see them, the artisans have them, and they're wooden wheels, and they're beautifully decorated with bits of copper, and they look really attractive. One bullock and the cart, quite small, but we didn't need big. So I was meditating. This is the type of cart that Krishna would have. We should have for the Sankirtan party. So Srila Prabhupada said, we will release books from the BBT. And then I was stuck between a bit of a rock and a hard place there, because I was going to have to disagree with Prabhupada and tell him that, we couldn't take the books. So Prabhupada said, I'll release books from the BBT, you distribute the books, you raise the money, you buy the cart. And I said to Prabhupada, that won't work. So he said, why not? I said, well, in the villages, Srila Prabhupada, when we distribute a book, that book is passed around the village. So sometimes we distribute one book in the village, and all of the other activities in the village are done by bartering. And Prabhupada said, that is correct. So I was slightly relieved that, So he said, so I will give you the money from my personal account, but you have to pay it back without interest. So it was, and I think we got 5,000 rupees. I don't know what that is now. Not a lot. But at that particular time, 5,000 rupees was enough. But then, so I was thinking, result. Prabhupada's agreed to give us the money, and I'm going to go and get my beautiful cart. And Prabhupada said, and when you get the cart, don't get the cart with wooden wheels. He said, get it with inflatable tires, because that is not subject to road taxation. And I was thinking, how did Prabhupada know that? But he immediately took my brilliant plan and corrected it so that we wouldn't be in any financial difficulty. So I got the money, I went off to buy the cart, painted it saffron, I was a brahmachari, went and got 2 bullocks and went and rejoined Lokanath Swami's party, and of course we eventually got to Kumbh Mela. And Prabhupada, there were challenges, as I'm sure many devotees have told you, that it was put in the wrong place, and Prabhupada was quite upset when he arrived, and we were so far away from everyone else. The famous story about the elephant. It was Guru Das, I think, that was saying to Prabhupada, Prabhupada, we're going to put you on the elephant. Prabhupada said, no. He said, we will put Krishna, Radha and Krishna on the elephant. And I thought that was a beautiful pastime. Now I realized Prabhupada doesn't want glorification for himself. He wants us to focus on Krishna. And how he did it also. He said, people aren't coming to us, we're too far away, parked in the middle of nowhere. He said, so therefore we will have to go and take the Lord Chaitanya Sankirtan. This is the Sankirtan movement, we'll go. So of course, Chitananda was there, Chitananda Maharaj, and lots of devotees, Guru Kripa. So we went out in very brash mode, as you can imagine, very brash mode, and did Sankirtan in all of the big Swamis and Gurus. We just go in, Harinam, pick up the microphone. Sometimes they would talk mid-lecture. Take the microphone, everyone chant Hare Krishna. So we got Prabhupada's mercy like that, in a very brash manner.
So the reason why Prabhupada came to Nellore was that there were these 2 wealthy sisters. One was a widow and one a spinster, who lived together in a big house and who made a proposal by letter to Mahamsa Swami, who was the head of Hyderabad temple, which was at that time, well, then there was a temple that had opened later in Madras, in Chennai. But Hyderabad was the established temple in South India, that they wanted to donate 3 acres of land. In fact, there was a correspondence, and Prabhupada told Mahamsa Swami to accept the donation. But when Prabhupada went there was a stipulation in that donation that if a temple wasn't built on that land within 3 years, the land would be given to the Ramakrishna mission. And so ultimately Prabhupada did not accept the donation. However, he did agree to stay in the house of these women. It was a very spacious, he didn't stay alone. There was his whole, Tamal Krishna Maharaj was the secretary at the time. Hari Shori was the servant. and other sannyasis were there, like Achyutananda, Yashodananda, and I think Guru Kripa didn't come from Chennai. He was in Chennai. Anyway, we went on, Harikesh was there. Maybe he was, I can't remember, he was also there. And we went on the morning walk with Prabhupada. And as he came out of that big house, he saw a chicken coop, residence for chickens. And they weren't ordinary chickens. There were big, huge chickens which are called Chinese hens. It's a different breed of chicken. So seeing this, Prabhupada addressed on the walk, there were like 10, 15 devotees with him. He said, in Bengal, people take the eggs of these chickens, boil it, and eat it with rice. He said, they are keeping these chickens means they are not vegetarian. Now the community that those women were from is mostly non-vegetarian. Farmer community. So Prabhupada instructed, from today we will not eat what they cook. You have to cook for me separately, in separate pots. So Prabhupada was quite strict in India about differentiating between the vegetarians and the non-vegetarians. And he had told other devotees, don't eat in the homes of non-vegetarians. You can have fruit and milk. He told, Guru Kripa told me this. He was in Bangalore and they had contacted Prabhupada. But so this was a direct instruction. How, by his mentioning this, we should understand that we should never eat in the home of a non-vegetarian. However, in Tehran, he said, eat in anyone's house, but preach. So time and circumstance. But this is not time. Generally, the principle is don't eat in the home of a non-vegetarian. And that's Vedic culture. And that was very clear. He would not eat there. Even though they were the hosts, and it might not look good to the hosts.
In 76 or 77, I don't know, it was one of the visits. No, I think it was in 76. Prabhupada came, I was cleaning his quarters, and Prabhupada came back early, and I didn't know that. And I was racing in Bhaktivedanta Manor, I was racing in the door with 2 vases in my hand to get him on the altar. Not the altar, but Prabhupada's desk. And I looked up, and he was chanting Gayatri Mantra. And I just went, oh my gosh! And he looked at me, and with his head, he gave me permission to enter and put the vases down. From my obeisances and leave. So again, where fools rush in. But Prabhupada, in his kindness, just saw that, he was a little early, and he invited me with the nod of his head to offer my vases and leave. So that was really, I remember that. The lesson I got from that is, everything, is planned out, everything is timely. And Papa came back early, but maybe I was late, What is time? And Srila Prabhupada taught me at that moment, and I was racing in to get done before Prabhupada got back, and I got caught. And Prabhupada's, just everything's okay. Just calm down. Do your service. Permission granted. Go. So it was that pause moment, which is very important in our spiritual life, to have moments when we hit the pause button and reflect and just calm down and then be present to the moment. Yeah. And that was being present to the moment and not in fear, like like you know, a rabbit in front of the car lights, but it was, no, take a deep breath and listen, wait for permission, act, and retreat. A lesson.
We were walking outside near the temple, and there was our electric line came in from the there was a large transformer that was up on the pole, and there was a little tiny red light about 60 feet up that was blinking. And Prabhupada looked up. We had never seen this. We never noticed it. Prabhupada said, "What is that red light?" I said, "We don't know." Prabhupada said, "You should find out." Well, we forgot all about that. You know, Prabhupada was there. So many things were happening. Now, this was July, so Janmashtami was coming up soon. Janmashtami, this is after Prabhupada left. Janmashtami, we had a huge program where we were running extra lights everywhere. You know, really using a lot of electricity. What happened? That whole transformer blew up, and everything went dark. So again, Prabhupada somehow had some cognition that there was a problem there that completely escaped us. And these were the kind of things that we always found with Srila Prabhupada, that he seemed to have this kind of attention to detail, and not just details like that, but he was also very attentive to our management. There's, of course, many stories about Prabhupada, how he accounted for every penny, and in his journals and his diaries. And so this was typical of Prabhupada. He was not unconcerned with the finances and with the business operations of his temples. When Srila Prabhupada came into the temple room in Potomac, and just to preface that, the temple president had spent a lot of money getting ready for Prabhupada. He had spent tens of thousands of dollars, which actually put us in debt. It took us months to pay it off. I mean, it was for Srila Prabhupada. He was well intended, but perhaps, not really quite the way to manage. And Srila Prabhupada sort of exposed that. When Srila Prabhupada sat down as Vyasa-san, he looked up and we had just put in these beautiful chandeliers in the Potomac Temple Room. I think they're still there. And Prabhupada said to the temple president there on the Vyasa-san, he said, "How much did those chandeliers cost?" And the president said, $5,000, Srila Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada said, He said, "Be very careful how you spend Krishna's money." So this was obviously an instruction for all of us to be very careful in spending money and doing things in a very planned and practical way.
When we were preparing to launch the Padayatra program, we decided that we would have to try and get Prabhupada's blessings in different ways. So we went around trying to raise money for some sort of offering that we were going to make to Prabhupada so that he would give us some mercy. And we collected, 50 rupees or something. So then we were deciding, okay, what are we going to spend this on? And so one of the devotees said, well, okay, traditional offering, very specifically in South India, is coconut. And so we went and got some coconuts, but proper, not kacchu ones, not unripe ones, but real coconuts. And these Indian boys were really expert. So they managed to undo that, and then they would cut them in very beautiful ways, like in lotus and different things. So we got the plate from the pujari's, Krishna Bala's pujari room, and then we put these coconut and gur, which is pretty much all we could afford at the time. And we decorated the plate with coconut. We went into Prabhupada's room, and we said, "Srila Prabhupada, this is an offering, so that you'll give us your blessings." And Prabhupada looked at the coconut and he said, "Very nice." He said, "But I do not have the teeth." He said, "But you can distribute it as prasadam." So yeah, that was and I realized at that time how simple and humble Srila Prabhupada was. It was just a very beautiful thing. So we were so thrilled that he blessed the prasadam, but then we realized, maybe we should have come up with something maybe slightly softer than coconuts.
In December of 1976, Prabhupada traveled from Hyderabad to Wardha, which is 2 hours southwest of Nagpur in central India. And Mohandas Karamchand Mahatma Gandhi had his ashram there called Sevashram. Giriraj Maharaj, at the time Brahmachari, had made friends with Ramakrishna Bajaj, whose father, Jamnalal Bajaj, was a big supporter of Gandhi, and who had given this house in this place. It was a business family. So they're a wealthy business family. There was an Acharyas conference called by a surviving associate of Gandhi who was very famous all over India, Vinoba Bhave, who lived there. He was in his 80s at the time. Prabhupada was 80, 81, 80. And Swami Chidananda of the Divine Life, Swami Shivananda's Divine Life Society, was also there. During that 2-day program, Prabhupada went on a morning walk with his disciples, and there were like 25, 30 devotees. It was a good group for the middle of India at that time. Jayapataka Maharaj was there, Giriraj, lots of others. Anyway, as we started walking, I said, Srila Prabhupada, Mahatma Gandhi. And before I could say anything else, he cut me off. Do not criticize Gandhi here. This is his place. They won't understand. And then he changed the subject, and, we didn't talk. So the lesson was that, you should be careful what you say, depending on where you are. I mean, I could philosophize on that because, for example, in the Western world, Prabhupada used to say Jesus is our guru or Muhammad is our guru. But in Vrindavan, we asked Prabhupada, is it better to worship the demigods or the one God of the Western religions? He said it's better to worship the demigods because by following the Vedic system, you get gradual elevation. And then he said these religions, the Western religions, are the religions of the meat eaters. In a denigrating way, he said this. So for time and circumstance, we have quotations of Gandhi on every Bhagavad Gita. And Gandhi did read the Gita every day. Saying that he was an atheist, it's more accurate to say he was a Mayavadi who didn't believe that Ram and Krishna were incarnations of God. But he believed in a higher power. So Prabhupada did call him Duratma Gandhi at times. He criticized. But at that particular moment, he could not criticize. And we were not to criticize. And it was the wrong venue for criticism.
Remember, what was his name? Krishna Kanta, who did the...
Krishna Kanti.
Kanti. They were doing a recording of Srila Prabhupada, Golden Avatar, studios. And so everybody wanted to be part of it. And Jai Chaitanya loved to sing. But he wasn't a madanga player. And sometimes, and I remember he came home quite mortified once because he was praying the kartals during the recording and Prabhupada told him to stop because he was off beat. And Prabhupada was so musically in tune that everything, fit together. And if there was something like a little scratching in the background or a little off beat, then Prabhupada actually chastised. And I remember he came home and he was mortified because Prabhupada told him to stop playing the kartals, because he was off beat. And gave somebody else the kartals to play. But he stayed in there. But it was just like, but Prabhupada did it as a teaching.
One of the amazing things about Srila Prabhupada was how he was always providing new insight, fresh information, new experiences for the devotees. We would encounter things we never had before and ideas that we hadn't previously thought through Srila Prabhupada. And he exhibits some of these in different ways. In Miami, he was giving classes under the banyan tree in Coconut Grove. This was 1974, Bhagavad Gita class at night. At one point, he was talking about devotees coming to Krishna consciousness. And of course, many of us thought we were somewhat philosophically inclined, and because we'd read the books and we were so intelligent, naturally we had become devotees. Prabhupada said, actually, all of you have come because of prasadam. Well, that was, everyone laughed and was very amused by that. And he turned to the temple president, who was a very intelligent, a very intelligent, cultured individual. And he said, you too, you also because of prasadam. So that gave us actually a little humility as well as insight about the power of prasadam. Another thing that happened, I think during that same darshan, there's that same class at night, he was taking questions. And a young man who had recently been coming to the temple but was a little disturbed, we knew that he wasn't exactly all there, we could say, or had some emotional disturbance. He said to Srila Prabhupada in almost a challenging way, why do we have to follow the regular principles? There was a hush in the crowd. We all wondered, how is Prabhupada going to answer this? Prabhupada sat back for a moment and then he roared, to keep you from going to hell. And it was so forceful that that young man, you could almost see him jump back 2 or 3 feet. It's almost like the force of that, was just incredible, and he was stunned. Now, of course, we all should take that to heart and realize, not just this young man, but because of all of our sinful activities in past, Prabhupada had indeed saved us from going to hell. So again, very, very instructive stories that he would tell us and lessons that we would get.
Well, obviously, eventually, the bullock cart party, what was Padayatra and became the bullock cart party, arrived in Mayapur, Navadvip, and we took the bullocks and the boat across the Ganga to Mayapur, and we arrived in Mayapur quite late in the evening. Bullocks don't like riding on boats. If you ever have a bullock, don't put it on a small boat. So we arrived, and very enthusiastically we ran up to Prabhupada's room to tell him that we'd arrived. And when we got there were sort of like shields. Prabhupada's quarters were there in the building in Mayapur where Prabhupada used to stay on the 2nd floor, something like that. And we ran up and there were these shields, and as we were sort of started to try and go in, Prabhupada's secretary came out and said, Prabhupada's not available, you'll have to come back tomorrow. And we were slightly disappointed. And then Prabhupada came out and looked. He said, who's arrived? And he said, oh, it's the Padayatra. Prabhupada said, bring them into my darshan room. And we were like in ecstasy. So we all piled in there, and the lights were turned on, and Prabhupada was again inquiring, how was it? And we related different experiences that we'd had on Padayatra, where some people were very inviting, and sometimes they were less inviting. And Prabhupada asked his secretary, who'd initially said that we shouldn't come in, he said, and I think this was probably the highest sort of benefit that Prabhupada, he said, bring the milk sweets from New Vrindavan, which, we'd been on Padayatra for like a long time, living on Kishori, and suddenly, we got these milk sweets from Vrindavan, which were absolute ecstasy. So that was, Prabhupada was so pleased with the bullock cart party at that particular time.
At the opening of the Krishna Balaram temple in Vrindavan in April 1975, well, prior to the opening, Prabhupada had Jasomati Nandan Prabhu go and invite prominent sannyasis who were Mayavadis to the opening. So one of the big Mayavadis refused. Your guru is giving Brahmin threads to foreigners, I can't come. But another one of those big Mayavadis, who's very famous, he's the one who translated the Bhagavatam into Hindi for the Gita press, Akhandanand Saraswati. There was a picture of him and Prabhupada at the opening. He came. And in that picture, I was with Raja Shekhar, the British devotee, British godbrother, standing behind them. And I saw that picture in Mayapur, and Raja Shekhar got it and he lost it. He put it in an envelope and mailed it to Bhubaneswar, and it got lost. But the point was that, people might ask, well, why did Prabhupada invite these Mayavadis to the opening of the temple? Devotees have told me, even recently, we hate Mayavadis, but actually it's not like that. The Advaitins, they follow the same Shastras They revere the Bhagavatam even, the Puranas and all the Vedic literature. And when it comes to Vedas, there's no difference. The difference is in the interpretation of Vedanta, where Adi Shankaracharya says that the impersonal is the real absolute truth. And the Vaishnavacharyas say Vishnu, Krishna. Chaitanya Charitamrita says there's no difference between, well, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said there's no difference between the name of Krishna and Vishnu. Or there's no difference between Krishna and Vishnu. So Vaishnava means follower of Vishnu. But otherwise, we share the same culture. The Vedic culture, only the Mayavadis worship demigods, and Vaishnavas don't worship demigods. Some Vaishnavas won't go in demigod temples. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu went in the demigods' temples and bowed down to the demigods. So we follow Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But there's no difference in the culture. So although we may disagree ideologically on what the ultimate absolute truth is, we are from one culture.
By the grace of Srila Prabhupada only, in 1975, Srila Prabhupada instructed my husband to bring me to India for the opening of the Krishna Balaram temple for Janmashtami. In the end, as we know, it didn't open then, but Prabhupada told Jai Tirtha, bring your wife. Shock. And so, by Srila Prabhupada's grace, Prabhupada was leaving LA, and we all were traveling together. And there were two different flights. Pradyumna and Jai Tirtha and I were on one flight, and Srila Prabhupada and Shuddhakirti, and I think it might have been Nitai, one others were on another flight. So we went to Delhi, and we got there. Our flight got in just a little bit before Srila Prabhupada's flight. And we got to remember the old temple in Delhi, Tejas' temple, Tadamol Lane. It was a tiny little temple. And Tejas and Madeira. And Madeira invited me. There were no women there. And Srila Prabhupada's quarters were Tejas' office, I think, right off the kitchen. And so Madeira invited me to help her cook. And so we were making Srila Prabhupada's lunch. And he came in, took shower. And then the whole time we were cooking, he was playing the harmonium. All the songs of Narottam Das Thakur and Bhakti Vinod Thakur and Krishna Das Kavira. He was just singing the whole time, the whole 2 hours we cooked. And it was like Prabhupada was doing his bhajan. He was doing his spiritual practice. He was home in Mother India, and he was just glorifying the masters. And I'll never forget that, just cooking and not having a tape on or a cassette or a record player in the background, but actually your spiritual master singing to Krishna and to Mahaprabhu the glories of the Goswamis, the glories of Krishna consciousness. And that was a huge gift. And I'll never forget that moment.
Going back to Potomac in 1976, one thing that was a very interesting incident there was when it was the 4th of July, and there was a huge fireworks celebration downtown on what they call the Mall in Washington, D.C. Prabhupada heard about this. He said, let's go. We were all very surprised but happy. We all go on a little trip with Srila Prabhupada. Of course, we were hardly thinking there was going to be about 500,000 to 1 million other people along with us. Anyway, Prabhupada got in a car, and there was a van, I think, full of brahmacharis, a big Sankirtan party, kirtan behind him, and then several of us in our cars were all behind, so we had this whole troop. And we headed down over the Washington Parkway that goes over it's over the Potomac River. So along the way, it's like very high, and thousands of people were lined up along the parkway so that they could see the fireworks. And the traffic was fairly slow because very, very crowded, and we were headed to downtown DC. And so the Kirtan party had all their doors and windows open in the van, and they're going. And so many, many people were hearing the Kirtan, and a lot of the young people, most of them intoxicated at that point on a holiday weekend, a lot of them were chanting kind of along Hare Krishna, almost making fun of it, you know, and like kind of jeering and chanting along with it. So we got down to the fireworks, finally. Prabhupada, I think, was sitting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and the fireworks were down at the other end of the mall there. Prabhupada said one or two go off. He said, okay, that's enough, let's go. He wasn't that impressed, you know, so we all came back. Now later, Srila Prabhupada said, the best part of that was when the Kirtan party was going, and all those young people, you saw that they were chanting Hare Krishna. He said, even if they were chanting in jest or making fun, it does not matter. He said they were hearing and chanting the holy name, and their spiritual life has begun. So that was very, very instructive to understand the power of the holy name and taking Kirtan to the street.
So while we were on Sankirtan distributing books, occasionally we'd have to go to one of the temples to get topped up, Mumbai, to the BBT or to Vrindavan. So often, somehow or other, we'd make arrangements to go back and pick up books when we heard that Srila Prabhupada was there. So double bonus, we'd get books and we'd see Srila Prabhupada. And a couple of experiences I had, one was in Mumbai. I went back and in the evening time, Prabhupada would sit on the roof, and there were 3 apartment buildings, and Prabhupada lived in the middle one, and the other people lived there, people who lived there before we bought the property and so forth. So you'd go past all their houses and then their places where they lived, and you get to Prabhupada's room. Mm. Up on the roof, Prabhupada would sit there and give evening darshan. And one evening, one gentleman came and said, I'd like to sponsor you for Kumbh Mela, because Kumbh Mela comes very regularly. So Prabhupada, and I thought, wow, you know, because when we were there before, we'd made such a big mistake. I was thinking, oh, you know, maybe this is a better arrangement, that someone else, someone who knows what they're doing, provides the tents and, you know, prasadam and everything. So I was like, oh yeah, this is a good idea. You know, someone else do all the hard work, and we just go there and do Harinam and distribute books. So Srila Prabhupada said, oh, what would be the benefit for you? Prabhupada immediately realized that this offer came with maybe some strings attached. And Prabhupada knew that people got cachet from associating with us. They, you know, if all the devotees came to stay in their camp, whatever they were doing was, you know, made more important. So, and the gentleman said, we just want to, you know, facilitate you at Kumbh Mela. He made it very nice. He said, and what is the philosophy of your group? And he was an elderly gentleman, I mean, probably as old as I am now, in his 60s. And he said, I've been a lifelong member of the Brahma Samaj. Okay. And so Prabhupada said, you know, so tell us, you know, what is your philosophy? So of course he started spouting this impersonal stuff, that, you know, we merge into Krishna. And then I saw Prabhupada do something that I realized that I couldn't do at all, probably ever, which was Prabhupada took apart this man's lifelong following. Prabhupada presented the personal philosophy in such a way that I felt sorry for this gentleman, that his lifelong following of the Brahma Samaj. Prabhupada just pointed out the fallacy of the, you know, the impersonal path. The Prabhupada said, no, Krishna is a person, and you're also always a person. And this gentleman said, and I realized if I had tried to say to this elderly man, no, you know, your philosophy is wrong, we would have just got into an argument. But somehow Prabhupada just totally convinced this person that his lifelong following was completely misguided, and that he should, you know, take to the process of Krishna consciousness. And I was just absolutely in awe of that ability. And I realized it's because Prabhupada didn't have false ego. That his presentation of Krishna consciousness was so beautiful and pure that actually, you know, presenting it to anyone, they would accept it. So that was one experience in Mumbai.
So during our 2 days in Wardha, besides meeting with Vinoba Bhave, which was one of the highlights, where Prabhupada showed the pictures, like we used to show pictures to businessmen to make them life members, Prabhupada was showing pictures of ISKCON activities around the world, and very good, Vinoba Bhave was saying. He was a very famous person. And so that showed Prabhupada, there's a little lesson there, you know, how Prabhupada was propagating, even with these people, his activities. Then later on, there was this lecture that Prabhupada was going to give in the college to the students. And there was a couple hundred students, and Prabhupada's 30 disciples, and the MC, whoever it was, announced 10 times, Prabhupada will speak in Hindi, Prabhupada will speak in Hindi, and when Prabhupada got the mic, when he was finished, he said, I have been asked to speak in Hindi, but because of my disciples, I will speak in English, and he gave a lecture in English. So from that we can understand Prabhupada gave special importance to his disciples to try and train them in the philosophy and the ideology of Krishna consciousness. Otherwise, you know, he would have lectured to the public there, and the foreign devotees wouldn't have understood a thing. In those days, there wasn't this simultaneous translation facility. It was a long time ago. I was talking 42 years ago almost.
One other example of just an interesting anecdote with Srila Prabhupada when he was in Potomac. We know that July was the founding of ISKCON and the incorporation of ISKCON, and in 1976 it was the anniversary, the 10-year anniversary of ISKCON. So we baked a big cake and presented Srila Prabhupada as an anniversary cake. And so as part of that ceremony, the devotees handed him a knife. And he looked at it like bewildered. What am I supposed to do? Of course, in America, the custom is that the guest of honor cuts the first piece of a cake. Now, if you think about it from a Vaishnava or Vedic perspective, to ask your spiritual master to cut the cake and serve it to you as your disciple is completely wrong. And Prabhupada probably had no idea of this American custom. So somebody explained it to him how he should cut the first piece. And Prabhupada did not lecture us on how this was inappropriate. He smiled and he graciously accepted our cultural customs, cut the piece of cake, and then handed the knife off to another disciple to continue. So Prabhupada was always gracious and encouraging like that.
Yeah, during the Gaur Purnima festival in 1976, I was in Mayapur. There's a picture of that, by the way, that I have on my Facebook masthead. But Prabhupada had that same situation like he had in Bombay, where he would just meet guests in the afternoon in his room. And I remember some guests, and we were some devotees, there were so many devotees, everybody couldn't go, but some devotees, somehow I got in. And somebody was challenging Prabhupada with some questions, and I cut in, even though I was an unknown, you know, I wasn't a big leader or anything, and I said, if you want to learn from Prabhupada, you have to hear submissively. Because the questions were challenging. It wasn't like, you know, it didn't sound like he was sincere to hear what Prabhupada said. And Prabhupada didn't say anything, you know, so I took it that he approved of what I said. So, you know, that was an experience I had directly with Prabhupada. And you know, if I had done something wrong, I imagine he would have said, wait a minute, or he would have chastised me verbally. But, you know, there's Maunam sammati lakshanam. Maunam means silence. Lakshanam is a sign. Sammati, approval. So silence is a form of approval. So I took it like that he approved of what I said. And I didn't say anything wrong. And the conversation went on.
Another way that Srila Prabhupada was very encouraging to his disciples was often the way that he would treat I would say everyday or the average disciples who weren't big leaders, and particularly the women and children. So discussing some anecdotes about that, in Potomac, one time my wife had previously made ice cream for Srila Prabhupada, and he seemed to enjoy it. So I went out and bought the ingredients, and so she made homemade ice cream. I brought it to him one evening, and the servants and everyone was there said, "Oh, he just had ice cream." That they shipped it in on dry ice from New Vrindavan, from the New Vrindavan cows. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to compete with this. There goes my ice cream offering. But Prabhupada heard there was ice cream, and he said, "What flavor?" And I said, "Mango." Prabhupada said, "Oh, bring it." You know, we were intelligent enough to know that Prabhupada liked mango very much. So Prabhupada tasted the ice cream, and he said, "This is very good. This is the best." He said, "This is better than Bengali ice cream." I don't know what that means or what kind of ice cream they have in Bengal, but I took it as a compliment. And he said, "Bring it every night." And of course, that was an instruction I was very happy to carry out. Other examples of how he would encourage the devotees would be the way he would treat the women and children movement with such love and care. Sometimes we think of Srila Prabhupada, we see pictures with all the sannyasis, you know, gathered around him. And of course, he did have to spend time with his leaders because he had to give them personal instruction. But Prabhupada would take time for all the devotees, whenever possible. When we were in Miami in 1974, all the devotees were out on Sankirtan, and Prabhupada was pretty much there alone, except for some of the women and children. So my wife came to Prabhupada's room, and she brought our daughter, who's in Gopinath, whose name was Anya then, and she had made a nice picture when she was in the Gurukul of Krishna. Now, it was a child's 5-year-old picture, nothing special, but she was a pretty good artist. It was a nice picture, but she's 5 years old. Somehow, and I want to say by the mercy of Sri Kirti, who was always very kind to all of the devotees, he let her come in. And he said, "Oh, come on in. Prabhupada's not doing anything." Well, Prabhupada's always doing something, but you know, what he meant was he's not within another meeting with somebody. And so she presented, Prabhupada said, "Who is this?" And my wife said, "This is my daughter." And he said, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm her mother." My wife said, "Why didn't I even think to even give Prabhupada my name? I just said I'm her mother." So she gave the painting or the drawing to Srila Prabhupada. He looked at it very solemnly and said, "Very great art, very great art." Again, so you can imagine how encouraging that was. Also, I remember in San Francisco, I think it was 1974 when Prabhupada visited there in California. This is the famous Rath Yatra where Prabhupada got down and jumped, was chanting and dancing. That was really wonderful to see in person. We were there. But during one lecture at the temple, my wife was with our daughter, Lalita, and one of the other children started crying or making noise. So the sannyasi said, "All the women have to go out. You have to leave the temple." And my wife is, of course, devastated. You know, here I can't even hear my spiritual master give class. I'm here for Prabhupada, to see Prabhupada. So they had to go back in her room and couldn't even hear the class. But at the end of class, as often they did, they brought Srila Prabhupada cookies to give out. And so he called for the children. The doors opened. He asked for all the women and children to come in. The sannyasis had to part. All the kids came up and Prabhupada gave them cookies. My daughter Lalita Saki now, was about 1.5 years old. And so she had a little trouble reaching the cookie. So Prabhupada very carefully put it in her hand so that she could, have that cookie. And of course, and this was so pleasing to the mothers and to the children because they saw here was a moment when they and their children got some special attention from Srila Prabhupada. Again, Prabhupada's great kindness. There was one very special experience with Lalita. Going back to Miami again, when she was about 2 years old, they were taking a tour of the property. And again, most of the men were out on Sankirtan, so a lot of the women left and a few of the temple leaders. And my wife was pushing Lalita in her stroller. Now, Lalita had always seen pictures of Prabhupada, but here, somehow she put it together in her little mind that this was really Prabhupada, this was not the picture, so she kept saying during the whole time, pointing, saying, "Prabhupada, Prabhupada," just amazed it really is Prabhupada. I've always heard these pictures, everyone says this is Prabhupada, now he's really here. And so At the end of the tour, Prabhupada's walking up the steps of the porch to where he's staying. He turns around and says, "Who was that baby calling my name?" And so my wife thought, this is the opportunity. We can't miss this. So she holds my daughter up, straight out, and Lalita holds out her arms towards Prabhupada, and Prabhupada and her looked at her for a long, long time. It's like their eyes were locked. And my wife reports that Lalita was like practically shivering, you know, and having like almost like ecstatic symptoms, looking at Prabhupada. And Prabhupada just folded his hands and said, "Thank you very much." So we don't know what this means, but we know that somehow, first of all, these children are very special in their relationships, probably with Srila Prabhupada, but also just showing the kindness of Prabhupada, how he would always take just that moment to give every devotee something a little bit extra.
So we're on the morning walk with Prabhupada in Vrindavan. Brahmananda and I are from the Jewish backgrounds. And we started discussing the Jews and Albert Einstein or what, I can't remember all the words. So during this talk, I asked the question, Srila Prabhupada, is it better to worship the one God of the Western religions or worship the demigods? Now, why did I ask that question? Because there's a lot of propaganda, anti-Hindu propaganda by the followers of the Western religions that Hinduism is polytheistic. And we're better because we only worship one God. And we, followers of Prabhupada and Vaishnavas, worship one God, Vishnu. And the devatas, the demigods, are his servants in our ideology. And Prabhupada's response was that it's better to worship the demigods because by worshiping the demigods you get gradual elevation, quote unquote. And then again, quote unquote, these religions, the Western religions is unquote. But quote, these religions are the religions of the meat eaters. Now if you think about it, there are a number of Hindus that eat meat. Like in Calcutta, there's a Kali temple where they kill goats. And supposedly they're offered to the goddess Kali. That goes on in Assam also, in Guwahati. There's Kamakya Devi. So Kali Devi, there are different sacrifices in the Vedas for animals also. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu talked with the Chankazi. Chankazi said, you also have cow killing. But when Prabhupada said meat eaters, my understanding after all these years and living in India for 44 years, is that he meant those who are cow killers. Why? Well, Prabhupada stressed the protection of the cow 1,000 times or 10,000 times in his lectures, letters. There was the movie Spiritual Frontier. That's another pastime which I'll tell you about. I told you. So when you get elevation, there are different types of elevation. One is elevation to Krishna consciousness. There's a book like that where you understand Vaishnavism. Where, that's Gita teaches, aham sarvasya prabhavo, everything comes from me. I'm the source of everything. I'm the supreme God. But there's demigod worship. And so that's where Western religions criticize Hinduism. But Prabhupada said that's better than the Western religions because they, from the root, are contaminated with cow killing.
When Prabhupada came in 1977, and he came to Bhaktivedanta Manor as his last place of coming out of India, and it was such a challenging time, because Prabhupada was so unwell and he was so weak. And when he came, and Jai Tirtha, everyone met him and they took him upstairs in the palanquin. And then when he got out of the palanquin, he stood up and he hugged Jai Tirtha. And tears were running down his eyes. And he said, "I have come for your Tirtha." And they were both sobbing. And Prabhupada could see the future. Prabhupada could see that, that there were challenges ahead. But Prabhupada had so much love and kindness and mercy and affection that he came and he hugged Jayatirath and he cried in his arms. That is, and what everybody says, he had a breakdown, whatever happened to him. It was a huge part of the drama, like the Mahabharata, nothing goes smoothly. But he did love Srila Prabhupada, even though at the end he was a broken man, maybe. And maybe you shouldn't cut that out. But he did have, his mental challenges and his physical challenges. He was 29 years old when he became a guru. The day after his 29th birthday, Prabhupada left. And these are just young children trying to be honorable and follow a giant. The Shaktavesh avatar of Nityananda Prabhu. Yeah? So.
And then when I went to Vrindavan, again, Srila Prabhupada was there, and Prabhupada would come out from his room and circumambulate the temple and then go in for darshan and Guru Puja. So there were no cleaners at that time. When you arrived at the temple commander said, you're doing this, you're doing that. You got engaged. And so I got there and they said, okay, you're going to sweep this or do that. And then we would gather in front of Prabhupada's room and he would come out and we would go and follow Prabhupada around and then we'd go into the temple. So this one time, I finished my job and I went round to the temple and the devotees hadn't gathered. They were all presumably doing their service. The Prabhupada was very punctual, and I can't remember, but he came out before the devotees arrived. So I was there waiting for the kirtan to begin, Jai Prabhupada, and Prabhupada came out. And he looked around, it was me, and he just did his, he didn't say anything at that time, he just went to do his parakram. So I thought, okay, well, we normally follow Prabhupada, so I was like following behind doing my little kirtan. So we got to the front of the temple, and Prabhupada turned and said, where are the devotees? And I was like, I don't know, Srila Prabhupada, they must be doing some service or something. Prabhupada said, where is Gunarnava, who was the temple president at the time? So I said, I'll go and get him. So I dashed round, and the devotees were gathering outside Prabhupada's room. Prabhupada had gone, but they were all there waiting for Prabhupada to come out. So Guru Narada was, I said, Prabhupada's around the front. He said, what's he doing there? I said, well, he came out early. So we all dashed round, and then Guru Narada came, so Prabhupada said, so. And they looked across. At that time, there was like a water feature in front of the temple, some fountains. And then next to there was they were still fairly newly constructed, and there were some go-downs, some places where they stored stuff against the wall, against the outside wall. And Prabhupada said, what's in these? They were just corrugated tin, very simple. And Guru Narada said, oh, I think there's cement in there. And they were padlocked. Prabhupada said, open the door. So Guru Narada didn't have the key, dashed away, came back, and then unlocked the key, unlocked the door, opened it up. And Prabhupada looked inside, very small, not very big at all. Prabhupada looked around, and he came out and he said, this is where I will have my samadhi. And then we went on. And I was thinking, wow, in 100 years' time, there's going to be a samadhi here for Prabhupada, And, Prabhupada went into Guru Puja, and I didn't think of that again, that he'd said where it was. And then, of course, not that long, I don't know, maybe a year, I looked down the side of the house where Srila Prabhupada was, his rooms in Vrindavan, and it was generally very low light, and the devotees were doing very low kirtan. And but this time the devotees were in the Tulsi garden in front, stacked up around, and I realized that something very important is happening. So I ran down the side of the temple, and of course You couldn't get in the front door, it's just jam-packed. But I'd been in Vrindavan before. So I knew that the kitchen in the guest house then backed onto Prabhupada's garden. So I ran into the kitchen. I used to keep the coal there, clambered over into Prabhupada's garden and ran through the garden doors. And the kirtan was there, Bharadraj was on the bed and the devotees were chanting. And but the thing that I wanted to tell you is that when I got into the room, the overwhelming impression that I got was that the holy name, we've heard the kirtan, it was not the usual kirtan where one person was leading, it was just some people, just some group chanting, some people following, it was just, everyone was chanting. And I got this overwhelming impression that the holy name was carrying Srila Prabhupada back to Krishna. And the room was full of devotees, and the only space in the room was Prabhupada's bed. And it was so overwhelming, this impression, that it came into my mind that perhaps if I looked up, that I might see that the holy name penetrating the coverings of the universe and see Goloka Vrindavan. And it was just, and I looked up and then I saw the ceiling. I couldn't see, I didn't have the eyes to see. And then I realized, oh, you know, no, you have to have Manjuali devi for that. But then, of course, you know, Prabhupada left. And then, of course, where Prabhupada said the samadhi was going to be, that's where the samadhi was. So that was not the final part. I, at that point, was ordered to go off and get Narayan Maharaj. Prabhupada had asked that Narayan Maharaj oversee the taking care of the spiritual master entering samadhi. So I went to Mathura and picked up Narayan Maharaj and some brahmacharis and bought, because I had the Sankirtan van. Some of there's advantages there, so that I went and brought them back to the temple, and he came and they took care of the process of preparing the spiritual master. And Prabhupada came out, and at that time, Prabhupada came on his palanquin and took darshan of the deities and then was placed on the Vyasasan. I thought Prabhupada is going to amaze us, because the Kaviraj said Prabhupada stopped breathing. He was no longer breathing. And I thought, so Prabhupada was sitting there on the Vyasasan, and I thought Prabhupada is going to amaze us all by demonstrating that he's transcendental to the body, that he could open his eyes and carry on. It was a reluctance in me to accept that I might not have the opportunity again. But I just couldn't accept it. And then the next day, Shima Prabhupada's sister came, and was it the next day? I can't remember. Maybe it was the same evening. And she came and she offered a rose to Prabhupada. And at that time it hit me that she was saying goodbye to her brother, and that this was the last time that we were going to participate in Prabhupada's earthly pastimes.
Well, I was consciously looking for a guru before I met Srila Prabhupada, so I have studied many traditions. And yeah, I knew that there was a reason for human incarnation. And so I was on the road looking. And what attracted me to Srila Prabhupada, at first, I thought the Krishna devotees were quite out there. I did the Woodstock thing and everything, but the Krishna devotees were really strict. And I thought, actually, as I became attracted to, I loved the singing of Srila Prabhupada. I loved, actually, the fact that he had clear boundaries with his disciples, and he set clear boundaries for devotees to live in community. And I thought that was really noble. I think I liked the idea, and I felt attracted to Srila Prabhupada because there was a whole package. It wasn't just do your own thing and it's an add-on. It was actually, he invited us to love God. he invited us to do this process and follow his example. And he lived it. So by following his example and by dedicating ourselves to the quest, you know, who is Krishna? Who is Guru? I don't know who Guru is. I don't know who Krishna is. But he was a mystical, affectionate, wise teacher who, for me, I felt had my best interest at heart. He was noble in how he related with the devotees, and he was a warrior, and sometimes too much. I thought, oh my God, the way you do, But he actually had a very short window to do an amazing piece of work. And Srila Prabhupada, he met his spiritual master in, 1923 or 22, something early. And he was my age. He was 70 when he actually started doing the work. And, I just think, oh gosh, I'm 70, and how can I have the energy to do? And that's because Srila Prabhupada, I firmly believe, was empowered by Lord Krishna and by the lineage of Mahaprabhu, by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, to be the one to bring this grace to the Western countries and to touch us in a way that is miraculous, really. And he didn't tell us to give up. He said, he didn't say give up this, give up that. He said, include Krishna. So in the beginning, it was very, strict. I mean, it was always very strict, but, we just did. And then as we got older, he just encouraged us, and he does encourage us every day. And that's the message of Srila Prabhupada as well, is that his presence isn't just his physical presence. Every day we sit down and we chant our japa, Prabhupada's presence is there. Every day we open a book and read a slok, our heads bow in gratitude and presence, because Prabhupada is our ever well-wisher. He signed our letters like that, your ever well-wisher, and he's our true ever well-wisher. So as opposed, I don't know other gurus, I know him. And I'm not comparing teachers, because everybody comes, and Guru is one. Srila Prabhupada told us, so many people can come and help us along the way, shikshas. And that is, I believe, Srila Prabhupada helping us. Okay?
Jai Anilo Prema Dana